What if I told you that losing a boss fight actually makes it better? Sounds frustrating, right? Say you're playing Demon Souls for the first time and you encounter the Vanguard Demon. You spend a bunch of time wailing on him just to lose and be set back a bunch. Sure, to you and me, that's frustrating. But compare that to the first battle with Vile in Mega Man X or some of the Pokemon champions. Like, I know you've lost to Cynthia before, but losing battles like that in those games isn't nearly as frustrating and demoralizing as being killed by the Vanguard Demon for the bajillionth time. Why is that? Why is it super frustrating to lose a boss battle in some games, but in others it just happens and you move on without really thinking about it? A lot of people will say this is because the games speak a different language, but what do they mean by that? I mean, the game looks different, sure, and the game designers are trying to bring different messages across, but how do they do that? And why do developers create these difficult boss fights? And it doesn't have to be just about the challenge either.
Looking at you, From Software.
Developers utilize loads of tricks that influence motivation, growth, gameplay, and storytelling. And some games may even intentionally put you up against unbeatable bosses. Not because the devs are sadists who just want to see players suffer, not most devs at least, but all of these impossible battles serve a greater purpose in a game's narrative design, gameplay mechanics, and tutorialization. But when a difficult boss battle is poorly designed, or the concept of an impossible boss battle is poorly conveyed to the player, that's incredibly frustrating. So let's take a look at the tricks developers use when they design these boss battles, and why it works or why it doesn't. Since I'm also a developer and I've run into the boss battle design problem too, I can also show you what I did in Blightwatcher. So whether you're a developer who wants to utilize these techniques to elevate your game's bosses to a higher level, or you're just curious why your friends won't stop talking about Elden Ring, let's have a closer look at just what we're talking about. In most games, you play as the hero. You are destined to overcome some arbitrary challenge. But of course, as the hero of legend, you have just the right powers, lineage, or MacGuffins to conquer that final boss. But what happens when we take this expectation of the immaculate hero and we get the big boss to kick his teeth in? Games generally carry the inherent preconception that the player is the hero, and the hero is supposed to win. Players expect to be able to overcome any challenge, and not being able to overcome it must mean they are missing something. There's lots of games where you, as the player, are missing something quite often. In the Pokemon games, you might be missing a Pokemon in your team with the correct type matchup against your enemy. In the Legend of Zelda games, you might be missing the necessary item to defeat an enemy in a new dungeon. In Dark Souls, you might just be missing the necessary skill. Only one of these examples is often considered frustrating though, and even then, most people don't agree on whether or not it really is. It can't be that just being killed by a boss is the frustrating part, even though that happens a lot in Dark Souls. If it's set up well, being killed by a boss isn't even frustrating at all. Take Vile from Mega Man X for example. The first time you encounter him is just after the tutorial stage. You've barely learned the controls of the game and here comes the big man to show you who's boss. As Ego Raptor so aptly put it,
all the things I've applied aren't helping me. He's just fucking wrecking me.
Yeah, you get the idea. You literally cannot win this fight, no matter how hard you try, but that's exactly the point. This battle sets the stage for the entire game, giving players an emotional load to rise from. But if you've played the game, you'll have probably noticed that losing to Vile at this stage is not all that frustrating. Instead, you'll feel helpless and powerless during the battle, but right when you're at your lowest and you're about to be taken out, here comes Zero to save the day. This moment here is exactly why some super difficult boss fights feel frustrating and why some don't. But how this whole thing works depends a lot on the game we're talking about. It depends on the theming, the narrative, how its mechanics interplay with all of that. There's a lot that goes into it. To make a long story short, in the case of Mega Man X, it's a combination of two factors. The first is that you've only just started playing the game. This is the tutorial stage, you haven't achieved all that much yet. Hell, the world record speedrun for Mega Man X gets to the battle with Vile in under 2 minutes. The stakes don't feel all that high yet. Even if you've never played the game before and you don't know what's gonna happen, you're probably still comfortable losing to this guy. At the end of the day, you can just reset your SNES, go back in time a few minutes and try again from the start. But even if you could do that, you're still gonna have to face Vile eventually, and you know you're probably still unprepared for him. So if you had to go through this whole rigmarole of resetting the game and trying again without any more information, it's still gonna be frustrating. That's where the second factor comes in. Zero saves you. You don't lose any progress and the story continues on. From this point on, you realize you weren't meant to win this battle, but in your mind you have already solidified Vile as this super strong guy. Now all of that might be the case for Mega Man X, but that doesn't explain From Software games, because in most of those games, losing a big battle means losing at least half an hour of progress, as well as having to walk all the way back. You would expect people to absolutely loathe these games, and many do, but they still have a very dedicated cult following. This falls right into the psychological theory called self-determination. According to researchers Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, People can be intrinsically motivated to grow and achieve as long as they have no external influences or distractions to blame. The Soulsbornes of the world are wildly successful because they are a masterclass in forcing intrinsic motivation. When a player is met with a brick wall of a boss fight that, no matter how hard they try, they just can't seem to punch through, one of two things will happen. There's a good chance the player blames external influences, such as unfair programming, screen glare, or even input lag. It's up to the developers to mitigate how strongly these external signals are registered to players. Mitigating feelings of unfair programming or input lag are a whole beast of their own. Also, check out my last video about that. However, if there's no external factors to blame, players will be met with a moment of introspection. At this point, how players feel about the game is completely out of control of the game itself. Some players may put down the game and never touch it again because they didn't come to the same realization that other players did. A sudden aha moment of serenity where players realize they are approaching the problem in the wrong way. The Soulsborne community spreads this knowledge in their own supportive way by telling you to just get good, but what they lack in tact, they make up for in knowledge. You are the common denominator, and it's not you as a person that's wrong, it's how you're going about this boss battle that is. Now, even this serene moment of realization can be explained by psychology. It's driven entirely by the three universal needs of the theory of self-determination: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So that's being able to make your own decisions, being capable of performing the task at hand, and the desire to be part of the group of people that did beat the boss. When you visualize this whole psychological process in a flowchart, you see exactly why the Soulsborne games have the reputation they do. In most cases, players leave the game feeling frustrated and don't return to try again. Only 1 out of 4 outcomes results in players retrying, and this needs to happen over and over again for someone to finally get through the whole game. But as any Soulsborne fan will tell you, when you do finally get through that challenge, it's pure euphoria. So, alright, now we know that our boss battles are allowed to be difficult, even impossible. It's just important to keep in mind that they shouldn't feel punishing to the player. It's alright if the player is stressed during the boss fight, but if your boss is actually impossible to beat, for the love of God, don't make players walk all that way back just because they dared challenge the wrong opponent. You can punish the player a bit for making mistakes and being unprepared, that's fine, but as a developer, you have to make it clear to the player why they lost this battle. Is it because their character is not strong enough yet? Is it because they didn't collect enough stars or jiggies or chaos emeralds or what have you? If you don't provide answers to these questions, you're gonna be left with frustrated players, or worse yet, no players at all. Now I'm sure you've all seen Design Doc's video, What Makes a Great Impossible Boss, and if you haven't, you should definitely watch it. But in that video, he raises an interesting point that I disagree with.
Impossible bosses aren't normal bosses. They can't be. A boss that works like all the other bosses but is impossible to beat does make the game stop being a game.
I'm sure that when he's talking about these not quite regular bosses, he's trying to convey the idea that the player needs to know why some bosses are unbeatable and some aren't. This is most clearly conveyed in one type of impossible boss, the mechanical. There are loads of games out there that have some kind of invincible enemy that you're not supposed to face off against, but rather find ways to work around. To a certain extent, the Soulsborne bosses fall into this category, but since all of these bosses still follow the same rule set as the others, I'm pulling them apart from bosses such as Mr. X or Jack Baker from Resident Evil. These mechanics-based bosses serve as a constant driving force to push the player through the game at a certain pace. You're not supposed to face off against them, you're supposed to run from them and continue further down an uncomfortable road. These kinds of bosses are incredibly common in horror games because of the helpless panic they induce in the player. Other than the purely mechanical, there's also the narrative bosses, like Vile, who serve to set up a part of the story arc. The first beatdown in Mega Man X, and many others like it in other games, is pretty much synonymous with the Abyss in the hero's journey, as coined by Joseph Campbell. Even though it doesn't take place halfway into the story, this event serves to set up the baseline, the power level where X starts, and the eventual target in the personal parallel character, Zero. This point is driven home even more when Zero quite literally tells X that one day, X will be as strong as him. Bosses in this narrative category are often impossible just because it sets up the narrative arc so well. The player doesn't just read that Vile is a dangerous, strong guy, they feel it through gameplay. Now to get back to the bosses in the Soulsbornes, let's forget about FromSoft for a second and move on to my darling game series, Monster Hunter. If you've played both the game series, you will probably already know where I'm going with this. But even though there's a huge difference in the tone between the two game series, the actual gameplay loop is quite similar. You go out into the vast world, you find a gigantic monstrous creature to fight off against, it pushes your spine out your backside, and you return at your bonfire or campsite or whatever else, only to try it all again later, hopefully with some new skills and maybe some better gear. If you look closely at the gameplay loop here, it also follows the hero's journey a bit, and even besides that, the game has taken advantage of that same self-determination I talked about before. These kinds of bosses, while not entirely impossible, should be really difficult. The developers expect you to die to them at least a couple of times before succeeding. If you're designing a boss like this, there's at least one other psychological theory to keep in mind, and that's learned helplessness. If the player has no ray of hope through being beaten up over and over again, they will start to think the game is broken somehow and they weren't ever supposed to beat this boss. This is where that frustration we talked about kicks in, and unless you're making a spiritual successor to Dark Souls, that's probably not how you want your players to feel about your game. Now, to wrap up all of these ideas for Blightwatcher, let me introduce you to the concept of the two bosses you will encounter in the demo. One of these will be encountered at the start of the game, and the other one all the way at the end of the demo section. The first one of these is some yet-to-be-determined large chimera. It's an amalgamation of a bunch of different creatures from the local wildlife that has somehow conjoined into a monstrous entity that's able to take control of other creatures in the area. This creature was created by Weaxar, one of the gods in the lore of Blightwatcher. You face off against this colossus in the very first quest of the game, which is actually a flashback/origin story for Raymond, the personal parallel character. You start the quest facing off against easier to defeat enemies, but when you encounter this monstrosity, there's just nothing you can do. Eventually, you'll be run down to 0 health and your partner has to get you out of there. This battle follows pretty much the exact formula as the intro stage in Mega Man X. You start facing off against some enemies that are understandable to get a grasp on the rules and the controls of the game, but then, when you're matched against a foe that's a multitude of sizes larger than anything you've seen so far, you simply don't stand a chance. You're fighting for your life, but eventually you will fail and have to be rescued by some other character. Then, for the second one, let me first sketch the scene where all of this takes place. The town of Arborholm, which is plagued by some unknown condition that's affecting all the flora and fauna in the region. The crops are failing and the fresh water stream is contaminated, people are getting sick left and right, and no one knows exactly why. Oddly enough, on some nearby expeditions, townsfolk have been noticing that the large old tree on the cliffside seems to have grown taller all of a sudden. Now, slight spoiler here, but there's an unnatural fleshy growth underneath the tree that was put there by Weaxar, the god of growth and rot. This growth is a vessel for Weaxar to influence the area, and he's using it to poison the nature and drive the wildlife mad. This unnatural growth underneath the tree is exactly what you'll be facing off against in this boss battle. Now, this boss battle isn't impossible, but it is reminiscent of the first one since both bosses are creations of Weaxar. As a player, when you encounter this boss, you already know that you're faced with a very difficult task that even your mentor, Raymond, felt uncomfortable dealing with on his own. The difference here is, now that the player has progressed through the storyline of the demo already, the stakes of losing are a lot higher. Even if there's no permadeath, getting back to this point could still be quite frustrating if the player feels like they've been met with an unfair challenge. Because of that, it's important to me as a developer to convey very clearly to the player how to go about this battle. They can face this boss in many ways, but throughout the story they will be clued in on exactly what they need to take to succeed in their task. All of these boss battle design tactics are just a couple of puzzle pieces on how I'm crafting the whole player experience in Blightwatcher. They make up a big part of what makes the demo memorable, and hopefully they make you excited for Blightwatcher 2. I would love to hear what you think of the concepts of Blightwatcher and what you want to see in future devlogs, so make sure to leave a comment, I read all of them. If you got something out of this video and you want to catch the latest devlogs as we move towards the demo's release, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Until next time, we will be working hard on making the world of Blightwatcher come to life so you can experience it firsthand. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next devlog. Cheers.